All right, welcome back, everybody. We're here again with Aaron Good, host of the American Exception podcast. And Aaron, I just wanted to start off with a kind of big question that kind of ties into my own experience or intellectual development. And so when I was living in New York after 9/11, I would, meet a lot of people that had theories about who actually committed 9/11 that were, of course, different from the official story. And my reaction has always been, I don't really care that much about this in the sense that if a theory about the US government perpetrating 9/11 or being complicit in the attacks is what it takes to get people interested in politics and to understand that the dominant narrative about the US is the good guy around the world, etc., is false. If that's what it takes to get them in on our side, great, whatever. I don't care. But to me, it seemed like such a massive amount of time commitment to delve into all of the different competing theories out there about who might have been complicit in the act, and not just 9/11, Kennedy assassination, etc. So I guess my question is, what greater kind of leverage does the deep politics perspective give that a simple kind of anti-imperialist perspective that might use the phrase, we're governed by a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, or we're governed by an imperialist ruling class. What's the greater advantage of trying to delve into the individuals involved and their individual motivations and this much more detailed explanation that necessarily relies on less or harder to find evidence? What's the advantage of that over a kind of standard anti-imperialist analysis, if I can put it that way?
Well, in terms of thinking of the advantage in real world material outcomes, it's hard to say because in the actual political arena, the Western critics of Western imperialism don't seem to be able to influence the regime in any way, shape, or form. So in that way, saying one approach versus the other is going to be so much more impactful. I'm kind of past the stage where I think too much about what we could or could have done because I feel that these things are more overdetermined now, that no empire has ever collapsed because its population, looked at the political economy of empire and said this is unjust and we want something like that. Never happens. So why would we think that that's going to happen now? We in the West, it's a difficult thing to process because the myth of democracy makes us think that talking about things and then somehow that will translate into votes and that will somehow influence the system. And that just doesn't, we don't end up with a system that functions as a democracy in the interest of the population, really at all. So we should maybe think about whether we should think about getting too invested in ideological correctness or anything else, considering that not much of what we do has much impact up to date. And so how should we proceed? So I would say what the advantage that it has is that it has of really looking at deep political issues, is that it's more accurate understanding of the way that the regime actually functions. So if people believe in democracy and the rule of law, and you point out that this is not a democratic or lawful regime at all, and that on paper, democracy would seem to pose a threat to the rule of a tiny minority of wealth and power, but in practice, it doesn't work that way because they can fund all of the institutions and operations that go into the sense-making function of the public, the way that the public comes to understand things that can be so manipulated by people with money. But then on top of it, there have always been these ways. There's always been a deep political system in the US. And by that I mean it's a deep, when you say deep political system or deep state, one way to think of it is as a synonym for oligarchic system or oligarchic state. And so even in the early days of the US, it was pretty obviously oligarchic because only property people could vote, property white males, right? And then that the franchise eventually expands, but you still end up with basically an oligarchy of wealth and massive political inequality, and that's never able to really change. Part of the way that has worked is with when the standard dominance of political life by an oligarchy of wealth hasn't been enough just to be able to carry things out according to the laws that the oligarchy basically has a huge hand in writing in the first place. They could rely on deep political institutions like organized crime, like political machines in cities, party bosses, outfits like the Pinkertons, and so on. I mean, there was always a way for top-down power to carry the day in the United States. And there was also always some conflicts in the oligarchy of the United States. The most obvious one in the early decades and decades of the US is the oligarchy of Southern plantation wealth, and then the Northern, sort of proto-industrial wealth, which was not pure either. I mean, it was basically they also benefited from the slave trade, the big banking houses, and so on in the North, and they also industrialized in part with like money from opium China trade, the so-called China trade. That's a big part of Northern industrialization. And of course, the genocide of the American Indians was carried out by the North and the South. But they still had different factions to the point that they eventually fought a civil war, over them, obviously. So that was the older system. In the older system, and there were, by the way, assassinations back then. Probably Zachary Taylor was the president, was probably killed by some sort of Southern cracker conspiracy, and he was poisoned. I mean, he had symptoms very similar to arsenic poisoning before in an episode before, and then his death really pretty much approximates arsenic poisoning, and that led to the Compromise of 1850, which he had adamantly opposed, and that was the big political issue of the day. And his vice president does a 180 on that. So I think that's another case of deep political intrigue, which is to say oligarchic conflict. And that's really what the U.S. system is an oligarchy disguised as a democracy, or that functions sometimes as a democracy in some ways, in some narrow ways, but ultimately is a top-down system. And after World War II, this gets institutionalized and formalized with the creation of this national security state. But it's not just a neutral bureaucratic state that enforces the law and looks out for security. It really was the creation of oligarchic forces, and it had a mission of global empire, or hegemony over the global capitalist system, however you want to say it. And that was put in place. And so after that, you have more bureaucratized ways of deep political power being able to assert itself. So you have I mean, you had the FBI beforehand. Really, Hoover was involved in the Palmer raids and so on in the first Red Scare, but which was another example of oligarchic power. I mean, who are they going after? The Wobblies and other, agitators, right? In the original Red Scare. So it was there before World War II, but afterwards we have this massive national security state created to the specifications of people on Wall Street, oligarchs, for the express purpose of managing this new global system, uh, ostensibly to fight communism. Okay. And so this creates this new, even more murky system of top-down control because it's a global empire, and you really can't have an open and democratic government running a global empire. You're going to have to kill a lot of people. You're going to have a whole lot of murder and plunder and political manipulation and so on. And so we have a more kind of coded fascist, or a disguised fascist regime put in place after World War II, bent on basically running as much of the world as possible. They even seek to affect the end of the Soviet Union. And after that, they want to keep expanding into the previous areas of Soviet control. And that's what we've been living through in the 21st century. And so, if you want to understand this system, you want to understand that it does need pretexts for war sometimes, because these wars are not really in the public interest and they are not lawful. And so, they likely involve the staging of events to give pretexts for war, like the Gulf of Tonkin in the case of the Vietnam War, There's a lot of dubious information about the first Iraq War, the babies in incubators
Yeah.
thrown on the floor, basically goading Saddam Hussein or encouraging him to invade Kuwait, and then using that as an excuse to attack him and destroy his military and make the region safer for Western interests.
Hmm.
Um, so there's a lot of criminality that goes on, and then there are conflicts in the oligarchy, and there have been a number of crimes around the office of the presidency. You could call them state crimes against democracy, but the Kennedy assassination is a pretty obvious one, which people have, spoken about at length. And he himself was an oligarch. I mean, Joe Kennedy was part of Dwight Eisenhower's foreign policy advisory board. And this is a guy, and he was an ambassador under Eisenhower. He made a whole lot of money, especially in the movie distribution business and so on, and then playing the stock market. So the Kennedys were oligarchs, but they were taken out by another oligarchic faction. And it's not really as much about the individuals. Well, in Kennedy's case, he's an interesting individual. It's more that after Kennedy, that perspective of liberal internationalism, liberal lawful internationalism, basically was more of what he was advocating, which was also pursued even more overtly by Henry Wallace during World War II, arguing against an American century. But anyway, that perspective is totally, once Kennedy is gone, no president really has that perspective again. Likewise, even with Richard Nixon, um, kind of criminally inclined scoundrel that he was, and hard right-wing hatchet man that he was, also an anti-communist kind of fanatic, he also seems to have been removed by similar forces, by a sort of proto neoconservative factions in the White House and CIA and elsewhere. And after that, you don't really have a nationalist, an American nationalist in charge. I mean, which that sounds crazy, but by that I mean you don't have someone who has the interests of the American nation or the American people really as something that would inform their political agenda. You have people that are very much in line with deregulation, neoliberalism, and all this. Everybody after Nixon, we have this period of like Ford and Carter, but these are basically guys that are more conservative than Nixon, and they lead to Reagan, and then it's been Reagan and Reagan ever since. So the oligarchy of the U.S. Has purged anything other than this kind of hard right philosophy when it comes to foreign policy and so on. And how did this happen? Well, there were a lot of crimes around presidential elections. So you have Kennedy being assassinated in 63. You have the October surprise in 1968, where Nixon sabotages the peace talks in Vietnam so that the Democrats can't win. You have all those crimes that Nixon committed to try to win in 72, which he does by a landslide. And then you have Watergate, which takes that president out and puts in a guy who was never voted for by anyone. He wasn't even on the ballot as vice president. Even worse than Kamala Harris here. In 1980, you have an October surprise, which is a plot by Reagan people to keep Carter from being reelected. And David Rockefeller, who had been Carter's patron, even joins in that effort. Eventually, he switches and says, Reagan's probably better for me and my interests. In 1988, you had Gary Hart apparently taken down by some kind of honey trap operation, if you recall that story, where he had this comely young model, Donna Rice, sitting on his lap. Oh, he's photographed there, and that led to, he was probably Bush's most serious adversary in 1988, and he was taken down by a strange operation. Donna Rice, it turns out, had previously been on a member of Adnan Khashoggi's harem, on his yacht that he rode around the world, that he rode around the world in. And she later years later, went on to work. She married some billionaire and set up a foundation to help like trafficked women. So, which is, I think, something to do with her past, which is, I guess that's a nice thing to do. But she was another person involved in these presidential election intrigues. 1992, probably George H.W. Bush loses because he did not please the Israel lobby because he wanted to argue for, he basically compelled Israel to enter into negotiations for a Palestinian state. That is probably, and he believed, H.W. Bush believed, I was arguing this beforehand, and then I found out from someone who is friendly with someone in the Bush family that H.W. Bush himself believed that the reason he lost was because of the Israel lobby. Um, and then in 2000, you have a stolen election in Florida, and probably in 2004. And then there's the crazy Russiagate stuff in 2016, and then there's January 6th in 2020. So there have been a number of strange and criminal episodes that have decided presidential elections because the president does actually have power in this system. He controls the executive branch if he wants to. He can fire the head of the CIA. That might
So,
make it
so
worse
how,
for him.
if I may jump in for a moment,
Yeah,
Aaron. So
sure.
how do you factor in the attack on Donald Trump? Because I hear a lot of theories, and for example, when you watch George Galloway's show, he always says that it must be a deep state action. And I always think it makes for me so no sense for a deep state kind of plot to try and kill him on the day that there is the most security around him ever, while they can just kill him when he's doing his evening walk somewhere, or he's eating his dinner when nobody's looking. I mean, that's so easy for the deep state to do. So I just wonder what do you think is going on here?
Yeah, I don't know about the Trump things any more than other people. The one thing I'm extremely skeptical on is that it would be Iran. I mean, that to me is the most absurd hypothesis you could offer. But as far as you say, the deep state, and I think that there's different ways to think about the deep state. Um, and the more maybe the more significant one is as a pluralistic kind of milieu of powerful interests. And so it's not necessarily the definite article that you always would want to use, but it could be sort of a deep state type of conflict if there are other aspects of the establishment, some of whom may be within the governmental organizations, who want to get rid of Trump, then maybe they were behind these plots, or maybe the climate is so insane and we have such a, you know, dystopian society that we are going to create individuals that do these things. I mean, I know typically that's kind of a bullshit excuse for things, but some of these, it's possible that these guys are like that, or that they are actual lone nuts because we have such a twisted society, or it's possible that they are patsies and that there were other people involved in some of these things, and these people were supposed to take the fall, maybe not even supposed to be assassins, but were there other shooters that day when Trump got shot in the ear, and perhaps the guy that was there was supposed to be there to take shots at Trump, sure, but also to take the fall in case they actually did shoot Trump. I don't really know, and I don't have a theory on it. I could see a lot of people would have reasons to want to get rid of Trump, but Trump is a very strange figure, and I think that he may be an Israel. It may be close to the truth to say he's basically an Israel lobby plant of sorts. I mean, it's hard to understand his policies otherwise, and so that maybe. And then you look at how Kennedy joined sides with him too, and Kennedy ended up being a pretty clear Israel lobby plant functionally. So.
So
The short answer is I'm not quite sure, but it's very weird what's happened to Trump.